Hi, good morning, everyone. For those of you joining us from Singapore or Asia, good evening. For those of you, at least on the East Coast in the United States, my name is Jeremy Menchik. I'm an associate professor of international relations here at Boston University. I am totally geeked to be chairing an event today focused on the environment, on land reclamation, on the politics of social movements and climate change with a phenomenal presenter, an equally amazing discussant, and some really important topics that we're going to dig into. So this is an event for the Indonesian Social Science Seminar Series. It's a collaborative series between social science around the globe who are all trying to learn more about the politics, the challenges, society, and contemporary Indonesia. I want to start by thanking our speakers for educating us today, as well as the other organizers of the IS4, as well as our host for today, the Sydney Southeast Asia Research Center. I'm going to start by introducing our speaker and our discussant, and then we'll dig right into the content. So let me introduce Ryan. Ryan received his PhD in political science from Emory University and his MA in Southeast Asian Studies from NUS, National University of Singapore. He's currently a lecturer in the Honors College at Northern Arizona University. He studies local politics, business government relations, social movements, urban governance in Southeast Asia, and his work has appeared in prominent publications, including the Journal of East Asian Studies, Asian Politics and Policy, and the East-West Center Policy Studies series. Our discussant, which we are very grateful to have, is Associate Professor Rita Padawangi. She's an Associate Professor in Sociology at the Center for University Core, Singapore University of Social Science. She got her PhD from Loyola University in Chicago, a place near and dear to my own heart. Her recent works focus on the humanistic aspects of city making, particularly placemaking in city neighborhoods through collaborative approaches in research, teaching, and community engagement. And with no further ado, I turn the floor over to Ryan to teach us all something about social movements and coastal reclamation in Indonesia.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Jeremy. Before I start my talk on social movements and coastal reclamation, I want to give Dr. Padawangi an opportunity to remember an activist in Indonesia.
So let's take this brief moment to remember Mr. Suhali bin Urip. Mr. Suhali, or also known as Mang Sali, was one of the traditional fishermen in Muara Angke, Jakarta Bay, and he was one of the representatives of fisherfolks who actively protested against reclamation. So he was in the fishermen's group who brought fish to the governor's office in 2016 as evidence that they were real fishermen and there were real fish in Jakarta Bay, as opposed to the governor's claim at the time that there were no more fish and fishermen in Jakarta Bay as a justification for land reclamation. So he showed his Jakarta ID card, as shown in the photo here, and also his fisherman ID card as evidence that he was a real fisherman. Recently, on Monday, 22nd of November 2021, Mr. Suhali's boat was found floating empty on the bay waters with his engine on, and his body was found near the waters of Islet G a few hours later, and he was 63 years old. So since our topic of today is about social movements against coastal reclamation in Indonesia, let us remember Mr. Suhali as one of the fishermen and also activists against coastal reclamation, as well as the struggles that he was facing. And let's remember also the struggles of all the fisher folks whose livelihoods have been threatened by coastal reclamation.
All right, thank you for that remembrance, Dr. Padawangi. Coastal reclamation refers to the process of creating new land by infilling the sea or wetlands along the coast. And these types of infrastructure projects have rapidly kind of gained prominence across Indonesia in recent years. They're becoming very popular. In this map, this map illustrates the locations of 28 projects that have been recently initiated, proposed, or completed. And as you can see from the map, reclamation spans the entire length of Indonesia from Aceh to West Papua. Every major island or island grouping has reclamation projects. This map is not complete. This is a list of 28 projects. I'm still counting. I'm still discovering more all the time. So I'm sure there are others projects that are not represented by this map, but nevertheless, it shows the kind of the scope of reclamation in Indonesia. There are a couple of important reasons. There are several reasons why reclamation is becoming so popular. First of all, reclamation creates brand new land in places where there was no land before, and this land tends to be very valuable in very desirable locations. And so reclamation is very popular among major developers. It's a very profitable opportunity for new development. Likewise, reclamation also offers new sources of revenue to local governments. Local governments can be involved in the projects, they can sell the land, and also they can assess property taxes on new land. And again, this is very valuable land and making it very lucrative to the revenues of local and provincial governments. In addition, reclamation may offer the potential to provide protection against rising sea levels. There's more and more attention in the literature on public policy to this possibility, and occasionally, not always, but sometimes in Indonesia, these projects are also discussed or justified with respect to the potential to raise the level of the coastal land and thereby protecting cities and other communities against sea level rise. At the same time, these projects have certain features that provoke opposition. In particular, reclamation is highly disruptive, both to natural and human communities. It can alter ocean currents. Obviously, it disturbs marine wildlife. It can increase coastal erosion. It is a wholesale transformation of the coastal environment, and it comes along with all the environmental costs that go along with that. In addition, it also is extremely disruptive to human communities along the coast. Reclamation it alters access to the coast. It directly displaces some communities that were living in the place where the reclamation is constructed. And it attracts new residents to the coast, sometimes displacing the older residents. And so for these reasons, wherever reclamation is proposed, there is an anti-reclamation that emerges, an anti-reclamation emergent movement that emerges to oppose it. And these movements too share certain similarities, in particular because the costs of reclamation across projects are distributed in similar ways. And in particular, there are two kind of specific ways that reclamation kind of has disproportionate costs across society. So first of all, reclamation, the burdens, the changes of reclamation are very local. Reclamation affects a very specific place, a very specific community along the coast in the place where the reclamation occurs. And so the costs, the costs of the physical change of reclamation are concentrated on those nearby communities, whereas communities farther away don't bear that same burden. And then similarly, reclamation also, the costs of reclamation, the burdens of reclamation are focused on, are disproportionately affect the poor. Because as I said, reclaimed land tends to be very valuable. It tends to attract high-end development. It tends to attract wealthy residents. And so the benefits of reclamation sort of accrue among the wealthy, whereas most often the people who are being evicted, the people who are losing their livelihoods, their access to the ocean, those are the poor. And so the movements that emerge in opposition to reclamation, they champion the interests of the poor, they champion the interests of those local communities, and they also champion the environment. And you can, it's a different kind of a similarity, but this slide shows flyers created by various movements across Indonesia, and you can see the similarities in the imagery, and I would argue that's sort of, that indicates an underlying similarity in the concerns of these movements. However, even though these projects share kind of similar characteristics and the movements in opposition to them also share characteristics, there is a very interesting puzzle when it comes to reclamation in Indonesia, and that is because in some cases, reclamation proceeds, and in other cases, reclamation does not proceed. And so the question that I am interested in this project is, why do some proposed reclamation projects proceed to completion while others are scuttled by popular opposition? And in this talk, I'd like to propose a brief answer to that question. And I will argue that the fate of reclamation projects depends on the type or on the composition of the movement opposing the project. And so I argue movements that are able to articulate an encompassing rationale for their opposition, a rationale that appeals to a broad cross-sector of society that can bring in groups that aren't necessarily directly affected by reclamation. Those are the movements that will be more successful, and they will be more likely to stop or delay reclamation projects, proposed projects. In contrast, when movements remain focused on kind of the locally specific direct impacts of reclamation, those movements tend to be more parochial. They appeal to the local communities, the people who are directly affected, but they generally do not kind of expand beyond those communities directly impacted. And in those cases, I argue that those types of movements, the more parochial-minded movements, will not be able to kind of mobilize the requisite opposition to stop reclamation. And as a result, in those places, reclamation will proceed. In this talk, I will illustrate this argument by means of a comparison between two similar projects that were proposed in Indonesia in the last 10 years. The first project is the Nusa Benua project, proposed in Benua Bay off the coast of Badung in Denpasar and Bali. And the second project is the Center Point of Indonesia project, proposed in the Makassar Strait, just offshore from downtown Makassar. And these two projects, they have a number of striking similarities. For starters, the cities are quite similar. Metro Denpasar and Metro Makassar are very similar cities in ways that particularly pertinent to reclamation. So first of all, they're both large, approximately 2 million inhabitants in both metropolitan areas. Makassar is a little more than that. Denpasar is a little bit less. And then equally important, both of these cities are highly developed, densely developed, and they are very expensive property markets. Land is very valuable in both of these places due to the high density of development. By one measure, Denpasar is the most expensive property market outside of Bali, and the fourth most expensive overall in Indonesia. And Makassar is the third most expensive property market outside. I'm sorry, I said Bali earlier, I meant outside of Java. And Makassar is the third most expensive property market outside of Java and the ninth most expensive overall in Indonesia. So they're very expensive. And that makes these offshore reclamation projects extremely valuable, right? Because they create land where there was no land before, and that land is very valuable. Accordingly, the development proposed on both of these reclamation areas are also very similar. In both cases, high-end mixed-use developments were proposed, including shopping malls, hotels, luxury apartments, and parks. And then further, both of these projects were supported by similar alliances of interests. In both cases, the main proponents of the projects were provincial governments working together with major Jakarta-based developers. So in the case of Bali, that was the Balinese provincial government, and they contracted the project out to, or they awarded a concession to Artagraha. And then in the case of Makassar, that's the South Sulawesi provincial government, and they awarded the project to Ciputra, the Ciputra group. So these projects are similar in terms of the cities where they are located, in terms of the developments proposed, and in terms of their proponents. They're also similar in terms of their opponents, the groups that are opposed to them. So in both cases, when news of the reclamation projects broke, new coalitions of civil society groups emerged very rapidly to oppose the projects. In the case of, and in both cases, these alliances or these coalitions founded new umbrella organizations to organize the resistance. So in the case of Bali, that was the Forum Rakyat Bali Tolak Reklamasi Teluk Benua, or For Bali. And in the case of Makassar, the name of that umbrella organization was Aliansi Selamatkan Pasisir Makassar, or ASP. And both of these coalitions or umbrella organizations united similar kind of groups within civil society, including student groups, including community groups representing, the local communities, the coastal communities being affected, environmental activists, anti-corruption organizations, anti-poverty organizations, and importantly, both of these umbrella organizations were spearheaded by WALI, the environmental organization. And then in addition to sort of having a similar organization and makeup, initially both of these anti-reclamation movements articulated similar reasons for their opposition. And that's what you see here on this slide. On the left is For Bali's list of 13 reasons to oppose reclamation. This list is primarily focused on environmental harm. I believe 8 out of the 13 reasons are focused on the environment, including things like increased flooding, accelerating coastal erosion or coastal abrasion, and as well as protection of the coral reefs. In the case of ASP and Makassar, the emphasis is slightly different. The majority of the points here on the list of 7 reasons, according to ASP, are focused on economic harm posed by the reclamation project. So that includes things like evictions of people from their land, loss of marine-based livelihoods, and loss of access to the coast. There's also one bullet point here, or one reason focused on environmental harm. But what these 2 lists share in common is a focus on the locally specific, direct, immediate impacts of reclamation, but on the environment and on the economy and economic livelihoods of coastal communities. All right, so there are many striking similarities between these movements, which makes it very puzzling that the outcomes in Bali and Makassar were so different. In the case of Bali, the Nusa Benua project was halted. It hasn't been canceled yet, and indeed the government of Bali is continuing to try to kind of create a legal framework that would allow the project or a reclamation project to proceed. But nevertheless, that project is on hold right now. It has never broken ground. It has been blocked and delayed for the past 8 years or so. What happened in Makassar couldn't be more different. That project proceeded to completion with minimal interruption. Here you can see in this picture on the right, you can see the newly reclaimed land. The reclamation was completed in 2018, and there in that picture you can see the construction of the Mosque of 99 Domes, which is one of the signature projects. On one of the signature developments, I should say, on that newly reclaimed land. And so, this is the specific empirical puzzle that I would like to address in the rest of this talk. Why did such a similar situation in both cities lead to such very different outcomes? And I believe that the key difference between the anti-reclamation movement in Bali and the anti-reclamation movement in Makassar, and the reason why the Balinese movement succeeded where the Makassar movement failed, was that in Bali, For Bali, and the broader movement was able to mobilize many more thousands of people in opposition to reclamation. This table, the table on this slide, shows kind of the change over time in the ability of these 2 different movements to mobilize people in demonstrations. And you can see that they started out on a quite similar, they started from a very similar place and on a quite similar trajectory. Initially, the demonstrations were small, just dozens of people as they began to raise awareness about the reclamation, the proposed reclamation. And then over time, over approximately a year or a little more in the case of Bali, those demonstrations with dozens of people grew to represent hundreds and then thousands of people. So, you know, throughout the beginnings of these movements, their mobilizational capacity was quite similar, following a similar trajectory, which is not that surprising considering all the similarities that I just discussed. But there was a turning point in Bali in early 2016. You can see from this figure that in early 2016, suddenly Bali acquired the capability to mobilize tens of thousands, not just thousands of people. And in contrast, Makassar lost their mobilizational capacity. It sort of petered out. And I argue that the key change that happened in Bali in early 2016 was for Bali and the anti-reclamation movement successfully framed Balinese reclamation as a threat to Balinese identity. In contrast, in Makassar, there was a shift in emphasis. They moved away from talking about direct economic threats to livelihoods, and they focused more on sand mining. But whereas in Bali, Balinese identity has very encompassing appeal, sand mining in Makassar, though important, was nevertheless still kind of an issue that was mostly resonated with communities that were directly affected by the sand mining. So in the case of Bali, as I said, the movement initially began with a focus on especially environmental harm, but also economic harm, kind of directly posed or directly threatened by the reclamation project. However, it quickly became apparent in Bali that approach would not be successful. And so as early in late 2014 or early 2015, the Balinese movement began to lay a groundwork for framing reclamation as a threat against Balinese identity. And this was a very multifaceted, complex campaign to sort of change the way the Balinese public perceived this project. It started off with some very critical essays written by important Balinese academics like Sugilanos and Saras Dewi. And then it also involved extensive organizing among Balinese customary institutions, particularly with youth councils. And these councils organized many kind of artistic events. The struggle was dramatized artistically in many different mediums, including drama and music, theater, also banners, parades, and all of these efforts were intended to sort of create a link or reveal a link between Balinese identity and the reclamation project. But I would argue that the most important initiative or the most important factor was a survey that was undertaken by For Bali and led by Sugilanos that began in 2015. And it was a survey that collected, it cataloged, it enumerated a list of sacred sites in and around Benua Bay. And these sacred sites, they included things like temples, but also places with more mystical significance, like places where the land met the sea. And the survey itself proceeded in two ways. There was a team of interviewers that went out to Benua Bay, to the communities surrounding it, and asked people about the sacred sites. And Sugilanos himself read the Balinese literature looking for references to the bay. And together with these two different approaches, this map shown on this slide was created, which shows all 70 of the sacred sites uncovered by that research team. And when this map was, when their research was published, and when this map came out, it immediately changed the narrative around reclamation in Bali. All the groups opposing reclamation embraced this rationale. And perhaps even more importantly, in response to this map, customary villages, customary village councils across Bali announced formal opposition to this project. It was sort of a cascade of announcements. One one desa adat, one customary village after another, announcing their opposition. And as you can see from this map, those villages were dispersed widely across southern Bali. And indeed, there are villages up along the east coast of Bali that are not captured in this map. And you know, the geographic dispersion of this opposition indicates that, you know, these villages are not responding to the specific location, specific direct effects of reclamation. There's something bigger, broader at stake that threatens kind of all Balinese. Wiranata and Siahaan have a really fantastic paper explaining why these sacred sites were so critical to the anti-reclamation movement in Bali. And that's because these customary villages, one of the duties of customary villages is to protect sacred sites. And so that map directly linked the reclamation project to customary institutions in Bali and directly framed them as a threat to the mandate of those customary village institutions. And when these customary villages announced their opposition, that's when the anti-reclamation movement went from a movement of thousands to a movement of tens of thousands. In contrast, in Makassar, as I said before, the anti-reclamation movement in Makassar did undergo an evolution, but it was not a similar evolution to that in Bali. And so, where in Makassar, the movement, as I said, started out by focusing particularly on direct economic harm to communities posed by the reclamation project. But then over time, it shifted its emphasis to focus on sand mining. Now, sand mining is an extremely important issue. Sand mining, like reclamation, is extremely disruptive to natural communities. It alters ocean currents. It disrupts fishing stocks. It prevents fishing vessels from doing their work. It's extremely disruptive, and it is intimately linked to reclamation, because sand is the fill for reclamation projects. And so wherever you have a reclamation project, you will have sand mining. As I said, when the sand mining occurs in the ocean from the seafloor, it can be very disruptive. And so when the Makassar project contracted with the Dutch firm Boskalis to start sand mining in the Makassar Strait, it immediately kind of escalated tensions over this issue. There were conflicts, direct confrontations, I should say, between sand mining vessels and fishing vessels. This picture illustrates that somewhat. In the background there, you can see the Fairway, which is a sand mining vessel owned by Boskalis, mining sand for the reclamation project in Makassar. And the smaller vessels in the foreground are police vessels escorting it, protecting it so that it could continue its operations of mining sand. So because of the seriousness of this issue, the disruption caused by the sand mining, over time, the anti-reclamation in Makassar began to emphasize this aspect of this threat or this cost of reclamation more and more. But that threat, important though it is, did not have the same kind of broad encompassing appeal across Makassar society as the threat against sacred sites did in Bali. And so this picture here, this is an image from a demonstration at the center point of Indonesia, and it kind of illustrates that the shift in emphasis to sand mining didn't necessarily broaden the appeal of this movement. So that banner there, it reads, "Save RC, reject sand mining in the Takalar Sea." So you can see Takalar is the name of a district, of a kabupaten that neighbors Metro Makassar. And so you can see that there's still a very local emphasis in this demonstration. They're focused on the livelihoods of the people living in Takalar. It's not a broad appeal that can kind of draw in people from across Makassar society. And as a result, I argue the anti-reclamation movement in Makassar never never achieved the same ability as in Bali to mobilize large numbers of people in opposition to the project. And this had very important consequences for the repertoire of action of these movements, or for their strategic options in terms of how they opposed reclamation. In the case of Bali, the anti-reclamation in Bali literally could immobilize the city with massive demonstrations, shut down the highways and such. And they could also influence elections. Candidates in the gubernatorial election of 2018 had to cater to this movement. Reclamation was a very important issue in that campaign. And the movement in Makassar just did not have the same strategic options. They couldn't shut down the city through demonstrations. They didn't have the same ability to influence elections to the same extent. And they were primarily limited to litigation as a way of trying to block the project. But when while his lawsuit against the provincial government failed in court, there was little left for that movement to fall back on. And as a result, the reclamation project in Makassar proceeded without interruption. I think there are two big implications of this project. The first one is that where reclamation proceeds, where reclamation is constructed, it's highly likely to be constructed against the wishes, sort of over the objections of the poor and of local coastal communities. And moreover, appeals against reclamation based on environmental costs or economic costs are unlikely to be effective. And that has a really important implication for the potential for reclamation to provide protection against sea level rise, because to the extent that it does, that protection is going to accrue to the wealthy who benefit from reclamation. And the poor communities that are displaced, they're not going to receive those same benefits. They're not going to be protected from sea level rise to the same extent. On the other hand, a second implication of this research is that where anti-reclamation movements succeed and where reclamation is blocked, those are likely to happen in interaction with identity-based movements, because that is the rationale most likely to be able to encompass a broad cross-section of society. And I think that can lead to some pretty unpredictable outcomes. It's hard to predict how reclamation can interact with identity-based movements that will differ depending on kind of the ethnic composition of different locations in Indonesia and produce unpredictable results. So thank you again for the opportunity. I'm really excited about the discussion as well as the Q&A to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Tans. That was absolutely fantastic. I particularly adore the map of the sacred sites in Bali and the potential for mobilization. I feel like my old professor, Tongchai Winakul from Thailand, who's written a lot about Thai nationalism and the power of the maps, have a lot to say. But right now we have more that we get to hear from Professor Padawangi, who will have 10 minutes to discuss Ryan's paper.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ryan, for the very fascinating presentation about social movements against coastal reclamation in Makassar and Bali. And I would say that I noticed that you referenced my chapter that was published in 2019. That particular chapter was also touching about social movements and social justice, bringing the case of Jakarta and Bali coastal reclamation, and I actually arrived at a similar conclusion at the time. Actually these arguments that unfortunately, right, that social movements that are arguing for social justice seems to have some limitations in terms of its appeal, its broader appeal, or to push for the cancellation of those projects. And I just want to show some images, actually some graphs that I think would illustrate why it was so. So this was one of the graphs from that particular chapter, and I just took the one that was about Bali. And I would say that actually this coastal reclamation, and pardon, I'm an urban sociologist, so I see this this phenomenon of coastal reclamation as actually part of this urban transition, right? So Ryan mentioned that there used to be no land there, and now they are building this land. And this is a kind of, when we think about urbanization, usually we think about, farmlands being converted into non-agricultural functions. But in terms of coastal reclamation, there are also sort of like a quote unquote farmlands there. They are actually the land of the fisher folks, for example, who are depending their livelihoods on the coast. And those coasts are being transformed into urban functions. This is actually statistics from Bali, not just Denpasar, actually, this is Bali in general as a province. We can see that this transition towards urban-based economy, which is, you can see the increase of trade, restaurants and hotels. Unsurprisingly, of course, this was before the pandemic. Yeah, this was 2016. And it's coupled with the declining share of farming, plantation, forestry, and fisheries. So we see this as an urbanization phenomenon, and this actually fits into this conversion, or at least the failed planned conversion of Benoa Bay from this land from this coast into the land reclamation project. So the push is there, the economic push is there for the urban transformation. And I would say that the pushback, right, by the civil society that are relying on the arguments for culture and tradition, those images of culture and tradition were also similarly used by the developers who were developing these projects, right? Especially for the ones in Bali. I don't think this applies to Jakarta or Makassar, but the developers themselves, the developer, I think that there's only one in Bali, right? They also feel the need to actually appropriate these images and claim that although the reach of this claim is questionable, right? That they also claim that they are based on culture. But of course, like Ryan mentioned, actually, underneath that claim, actually, these are functions that are very much urban, right? They're very much like development-based, urban development-based kind of images that are sort of like coated in under that frame of so-called culture. Now, of course, these images of culture and tradition, like Ryan mentioned, also appear in the resistance movements. And in the case of Bali, it seemed that it has the broad appeal. And I would say that all these movements, right, the demonstrations against the reclamation project, the demonstrations are not just in Bali. I just, I grabbed this image. Actually, you can see that the image on the right side is clearly in Jakarta, right? But it is a demonstration against reclamation of Benoa Bay, which means that the movement against the coastal reclamation in Bali actually spread to the capital to challenge directly the powers in the capital, since the reclamation in Bali was actually not just a local government policy, but it was actually a purpose, right? Based on a purpose, which was issued by the president in 2014. And so, and also this was the Pidato Kebudayaan by Saras Dewi in 2018, the Balinese scholar that Brian mentioned. Again, the culture speech is actually a very prominent highlight every year. And in 2018, Saras Dewi chose to highlight her criticisms against the reclamation of Benoa Bay in Bali in her speech. So again, I would also reiterate that, yes, it seems that all these arguments that integrate culture and identity seem to be the driving force of the success of this movement. On the other hand, I would also say that if we look at the economic dimension of Bali, that Bali largely depends on the the urbanization of Bali is also depending on that selling point as well. The appropriation of the culture of Bali to drive the urbanization of Bali, since the economy is really based on the tourism industry. The urban economy is really based on the tourism industry. So in that way, if they are proceeding with this coastal reclamation, that means that they are also contradicting the economic engine of the urban development itself, which is based on this, right? And so I think the economic factor also plays a role in how the role of culture and identity argument becomes so prominent in the movement in the coastal reclamation of Benoa Bay, whereas it was not the case in Makassar nor in Jakarta. And so we, again, to go back to our remembrance of Mr. Suhali, right? This is the case of Jakarta Reclamation. They went for the litigation, right? And it went through several back and forth, some victories and some not so good result. But again, in the case of Jakarta Coastal Reclamation, the argument is comparable to what the Makassar anti-reclamation movement was using. It's like, the reclamation is bad for the environment. It's also not socially just. It has this unjust impact to the poor as well as the fisher folks. But at the same time, the economy of Jakarta, the role of the fisher folks in the economy of Jakarta are, constantly declining, which is different from, let's say, the role of the cultural tourism in Bali, for the lack of a better word. And so I don't want us to be very disheartened about all this. I think there's something that still needs to be done. But we do need to realize that these land reclamation projects, right, on the coast, they are supported by both local and national policies, and they are marketed for groups of population that are wealthier than those whose livelihoods that are affected and potentially displaced, such as the fisher folks. So, however, the argument that manages to unite a social movement against land reclamation in these two cases is the culture and traditions argument, and not the social economic class equality like social justice discourse or environmental justice would suggest. So probably, I think this is also a call for all of us to also reflect whether this is a reflection of a larger problem. Yeah, that why is it that socioeconomic inequality not very appealing, in this societies? Like, what is actually this constellation in these societies that prevent the broader public to care about socioeconomic inequality, to care about social justice or environmental justice? Even environmental arguments, like the case of Makassar, while he always brought up the environmental arguments with mixed results in the litigation process, as well as the larger, like middle class kind of narratives. And so anyway, I just want to put it out there. So back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Professor Padawangi. That was absolutely phenomenal. I love how you tied it back to the beginning of the conversation. I'm chairing this conversation from Boston, in a building that's about a block and a half from the Charles River. And before you look at the projections for the future of one that's going to be underwater within the next 20 years or so. And one of the issues that has been discussed of how to deal with flooding in Boston is, of course, land reclamation. So this is an issue that is really affecting all of us. And I love how both of you are bringing the political economy, the social movement, the cultural politics to help us understand the present and the future of some of these clashes. The floor is now open to questions from the audience. I would encourage people to drop a question into the Q&A. Since we don't have anything right there, I'm going to go ahead and give Ryan the chance to respond to anything that Professor Padawangi put on the table. And then I might jump in with a question of my own. So Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Dr. Padawangi. They were really wonderful. I just want to respond to one thing in particular, which is that you said, which is that I think your comments provide a lot of really useful insight into understanding why it was that Bali was able, the movement in Bali was able to successfully transition to a broader encompassing movement, but the Makassar movement didn't kind of experience the same success, right? I think that was a question that my presentation frankly left unanswered. Is what explains the difference in the composition of the movements? Part of it was the activism for Bali, but I think you pointed out that the structure of the economies are very different in Makassar and Bali, and that in Bali, your point that the tourism industry sort of very much depends on this perception, this sort of like reified version of traditional Balinese society, that really, I think, helps us to understand why the movement in Bali had the power that it did. And then in contrast, in Makassar, there's not kind of the economy itself is not so deeply dependent on the South Sulawesi identity, and so that there's just not as strong of a link there, and so perhaps less potential for that movement in Makassar to kind of create or uncover that link as what happened in Bali. So thank you. I think that your comments brought a really additional level of insight to the issue.
Thank you, Ryan. So the questions are coming fast and furious, so I'm going to tackle them in the order that they've come in. Let's see. So the first, can we say anything systematic about how land reclamation politics might differ from other types of environmentally based social movements? I think about, say, protecting forest land or traditional agricultural patterns. Ryan.
Well, the question is phrased in the more difficult way. I think it's a lot easier to identify systematic similarities than it is to identify systematic differences. So let me just review some of those. Dam projects, deforestation, those also tend to have very kind of site-specific effects. If there are kind of broader effects, like in the case of deforestation, they tend to be highly diffuse. Right, the immediate impacts are all very concentrated. Those types of projects also tend to displace the poor, whereas large corporations, maybe not developers, but maybe developers are moving in to benefit and to create new developments for the wealthy. So I mean, that's a really valuable question. I think I need to think more about whether there are and what they might be, the systematic differences between reclamation and these other types of infrastructure projects that also provoke similar movements.
Thank you. Next question, and this is a useful pointing us in the direction of optimism. What solutions are there available to explore and perhaps adapt for the betterment of the future for all? So I think that the author is trying to help us understand, like, in terms of coastal reclamation and adaptation, what are the conditions that lead to positive outcomes, either in terms of climate change or economic inequality, depending on how you want to interpret the betterment of the future for all.
Maybe Rita, would you like to answer, or should I go first? And
You go first, Ryan. You're the speaker.
all right, I'll keep it brief because I'd love. So I mean, I think I mean, not to kind of not to fall back on procedure, but I think that the best way. I'm not sure that reclamation. I think that reclamation has a better chance of proceeding in ways perhaps that can be more inclusive of the communities that are affected. I'm not sure that blocking reclamation altogether is going to be a very successful or promising path forward. So I would say, and I'll be honest, I'm not really sure how to make this happen. Perhaps some kind of maybe local reclamation, anti-reclamation movements, you know, if they linked up. But if kind of the communities that are being directly affected, if they could be more involved in the process of planning these projects, you know, then perhaps the projects could be changed in a way that didn't make them quite so exacerbating of economic inequality. But I mean, to be honest, you know, that's exactly the opposite of what's been happening in Bali. In 2020, there was a new zoning regulation passed, and that regulation was written completely without the input of WALHI or any of the civil society groups of the people going to be affected by the new zoning regulations. So sorry, I just got pessimistic again, but I'll stop there.
The job of the social scientist is not to be popular, right? It's to be rigorous. Professor Padawangi, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to jump in here. Just follow up on what Ryan has said. You know, yeah, even if you see me smiling, it doesn't mean that I'm very optimistic about all these things. But as I said before, that this phenomenon might actually be a reflection of a broader problem, a broader societal problem, which unconsciously actually affect all of us, I mean, including myself. And the question about solution, I feel that that is usually asked in the pragmatic level, which is like, what do we do now? What do we do now? You know, but unfortunately, it's not about what do we do now. It's really about what do we do now and what do we do next and what will happen next and how to actually be ready for multiple scenarios that might happen in the future. And so I would say that unfortunately, I think that this actually involves a larger societal transformation. If this kind of economy, you know, that is really just praising this kind of urbanization as an engine of economic growth of a country keeps being honed, then unfortunately, this whole cycle will actually continue. Why is it that the fisher folks, the traditional fisher folks, seem to be valued less than those artificial islands on the coast? Like, what kind of economic systems, what kind of social systems that allow that kind of justification to occur, right? So those social systems, those economic systems have to be questioned. You know, why is it that if a place becomes urban, then it seems that the traditional fisher folks are losing their relevance? Like, why? Why does it have to be either or? You know, I just remember, I'm sorry to actually refer to the case that I know better, which is about the coastal reclamation of Jakarta. This is, you know, it doesn't mean that the culture and identity arguments are not there. You know, like there are heritage groups, there are, you know, heritage groups about the coast, and even, you know, the effort to frame the whole old city of Jakarta as a World Heritage Site actually failed because ICOMOS or UNESCO were citing the, you know, how is it going to be affected by this coastal reclamation project? So there is this kind of tension as well, but it doesn't stop it. Like, why, right? Why is it that it's so popular, it seems? And just to tie in with the previous question about what is the difference between, you know, this coastal reclamation with other kinds of environmental degradation, like deforestation and the threats to traditional societies. Well, I would say that this urban-rural differentiation, is making a difference here, which means that when it's affecting forests, which are outside the cities, right, outside the urban areas, they're kind of like far from where the concentrations of populations are. And it seems that it is, although there are social movements that are concerned with that as well, the effort to actually gain attention usually have to go to the city again, that to bring all the advocacy to the city. I also I remember that a colleague of mine was asking, Rita, what do you think? Like, why is it so difficult to get attention towards the threatened adat societies who are threatened by land grabbing and all these things? Why is it so difficult to get attention towards that? And I think, all these very much biased attention towards urban development is really making it a difference.
Thank you, Professor Padawangi. I'm going to pool together 3 questions that are Makassar specific, okay? And I'll try to make this as clear as possible. So first, are there governmental differences, right, that help explain the variation between Bali and Makassar? So for Makassar, the community is under the authority of Makassar city, not the provincial government. And is that important for understanding the variation in outcomes? Similar, tell us a little bit more about what happened to the displaced fishermen in Makassar and what the government has done for them. And then finally, on Makassar specifically, one of the questions focuses on the cultural politics of land reclamation in Makassar, which is that there was a mosque, right, built on the reclamation site. And so in that case, isn't that an example of culture being used not to block the reclamation project, but in fact as a tool to advance it, right? So in that case, the developers appropriated it very successfully. And so how does that factor into your argument?
Thank you for those very insightful and challenging questions. So let me just review it. So it's a governmental structure. The second one was kind of the ultimate fate of those fisher folk, and then the third one was the role of the mosque. All right, so I think the primary sponsor of the project in Makassar, though the project was located within the city, the primary sponsor was the provincial government, the South Sulawesi provincial government, and in fact, I think it took the city a little bit longer to come on board with the project. So I think in terms of governmental structure, I don't think that can explain it. There is, though, something that I glossed over in the case of Makassar, which is that in Makassar, it's a joint initiative between Ciputra and a local enterprise called Yasmin Bumi. I forget the last word, YBA, Yasmin Bumi, something. And so there, perhaps it could be the case that because of that local tie-in, maybe that the project was viewed as less threatening in contrast to the project in Bali, which was, as I think Rita mentioned earlier, wholly sponsored, the only developer was AntiReclamation, and there was no kind of local counterpart, so to speak. All right, so that could be one difference. Thank you, Rita. Yasmin Bumi Asri. Okay, okay, and then as for the fisher folk, they continue to oppose. The reclamation is only getting started in Makassar. So the center point of Indonesia, the reclamation there is finished. I believe it's still, the developments are still proceeding, but there are huge reclamation projects ongoing in Makassar especially for the port. The new port of Makassar, and so the opposition continues, and many of those activists are a lot of that political activism is being criminalized. the activists are being criminalized. And then the third one was the mosque. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that point, and I think actually that ties in really nicely with what Rita was saying about the way that the Nusa Penua project also tried to kind of try to appropriate cultural symbols that would resonate with the population in Bali. So I would see these perhaps as parallel, but perhaps in Makassar it was more persuasive, or simply that the movement didn't have a good response to that. I'll need to think more about that. Thank you.
A sign of a really fertile and generative conversation and an exciting research agenda is that there's more questions than time to answer them. We are out of time. I'm so grateful to Professor Tans. I'm so grateful to Professor Padawangi. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed every second of it. I look forward to continuing the conversation offline in other venues, and I encourage all of our audience to join us at the next IS4 seminar series in January. When I don't remember what we're tackling, but it's going to be awesome. Continue to learn with us as a global community dedicated to understanding the future of social science and Indonesia. Thank you very much. Good night.